Welcome to Stanford University Business School. Today, I would like to talk about management and leadership. It is very important that you realize the importance of management and leadership in this university. It is obvious that the purpose of this education to learn management and leadership skills. But you have to remember, this education of management should not only be about delivering services and making sure they're good quality. However, you should realize, it is responsibility of a student to accomplish assignment by themselves instead of depending on others. Students should be responsible for the management performance and identify how it could happen appropriately. The responsibility means that the accomplishments achieved by others does not necessarily indicate what they are truly capable of.
Straight salary sales compensation plans aren't very common, but they do have a place in some organizations. With this type of structure, you'd pay your salespeople a straight, albeit competitive, salary like all your other employees and nothing else. No bonuses, no commissions, and few, if any, sales incentives. This type of compensation plan is most often used when the industry you operate within prohibits direct sales. When salespeople work as part of small groups or teams and all contributions are equal, when your sales team is relatively small, and when your salespeople are expected to spend much of their time on other responsibilities other than selling. However, these plans don't tend to offer motivations to salespeople as there are no incentives for them to work harder.
Thermodynamics. All right, let's start. Thermodynamics is the science of the flow of heat. So thermo is heat, and dynamics is the motion of heat. Thermodynamics was developed largely beginning in the 1800s, at the time of the Industrial Revolution. It's the taming of steel, the beginning of generating power by burning fossil fuels. So anyway, thermodynamics dates from the same period as getting fossil fuels out of the ground. It's universal. Turns out everything around us moves energy around in one way or the other. If you're a biological system, you're burning calories, burning ATP, you're creating heat. If you're a warm-blooded animal, you need energy to move your arms around and move around. Mechanical systems, obviously cars, boats, etc. And even in astrophysics, when you talk about stars, black holes, etc., you're moving energy around, you're moving heat around, and you're changing matter through thermodynamics. And the concepts of thermodynamics have even been applied to economics, systems out of equilibrium, like big companies like Enron, completely out of equilibrium, crash and burn, right? You can apply thermodynamic or non-equilibrium thermodynamics to economics.
At the same time, you've got two British social scientists here. Dilys Rowe works for the International Institute for Environment and Development in London, and Joe Elliott actually works for African Wildlife Foundation nowadays. But she's saying here, poor people should not pay the price for biodiversity protection. So you can see the sort of the nature of the debate. What is the impacts that they're all talking about? Well, it's about whether you can achieve a win-win solution, whether you can achieve economic growth which brings wealth in order to cut poverty without damaging biodiversity. And the argument is that if you want to protect biodiversity, you have to focus on that as a goal, but if you do that, you run the risk of hurting the poor, and you also run the risk of inconveniencing or reducing economic growth. And we're used in developed countries, industrialized countries, to seeing this argument, this axis argued about with, let us say, a government wishing to start drilling for oil in place X, which is full of wildlife, and the wildlife conservation societies urging them not to on the grounds that it's a wilderness refuge. We're used to that debate. What I'm saying is that in the developing world, there's a third axis, and it's quite a complex one.
Mary Mallon, better known as Typhoid Mary, was the first person in the United States identified as an asymptomatic carrier of the pathogen associated with typhoid fever. She was presumed to have infected 51 people, 3 of whom died over the course of her career as a cook. She was twice forcibly isolated by public health authorities and died after a total of nearly 3 decades in isolation. From 1900 to 1907, Mallon worked as a cook in the New York City area for 7 families. In 1900, she worked in Mamaroneck, New York, where, within 2 weeks of her employment, residents developed typhoid fever. In 1901, she moved to Manhattan, where members of the family for whom she worked developed fevers and diarrhea, and the laundress died. Mallon then went to work for a lawyer. She left after 7 of the 8 people in that household became ill. In 1906, She took a position in Oyster Bay, Long Island, and within 2 weeks, 10 of the 11 family members were hospitalized with typhoid. She changed jobs again, and similar occurrences happened in 3 more households. She worked as a cook for the family of a wealthy New York banker, Charles Henry Warren. When the Warrens rented a house in Oyster Bay for the summer of 1906, Mellon went along too. From August 27th to September 3rd, 6 of the 11 people in the family came down with typhoid fever. The disease at the time was unusual in Oyster Bay, according to 3 medical doctors who practiced there.
The U.S. birth rate has fallen to a record low, says a new Pew study, with the biggest decline felt among immigrant women hit hard by the recession. According to the report, the overall rate of births per 1,000 women ages 15 to 44 fell by 8% between 2007 and 2010. Currently, the numbers are some of the lowest since records began in 1920. Many cite the recession of 2008 as a main factor to why births for the U.S.-born Latinas, in particular, have dropped so rapidly, as Hispanics have had larger percentage declines in household wealth than white, black, or Asian households in recent years. Meanwhile, another change in the American household: more singles. Data now shows that fewer adults in the country are married, 51% compared to 72% in 1960. And that Americans on average are getting married at a later age than ever. And in related matters, the phenomenon of adult professionals living with roommates well into their 30s and 40s is becoming more and more common, and not just in New York City. What's behind these social changes, and what could they mean for the nation's future?
Nowadays, big companies as well as developed countries are searching for the right talent for their organizations. Some young immigrants have a degree in university, and after graduation, they will compete with the local students. The actual figure is unknown. It is estimated that immigrants are a potential source for talents. The developed countries attracts the talents for future development, and the world has put the talents on a primary position. This has caused a global war for talents. There are 3 reasons behind this phenomenon. Firstly, the imminent retirement of the baby boomers will decrease in the number of labor force, and this will raise the shortage of skilled workers. Another factor, there is the collapse of loyalty. Employees have the freedom to change their workplace, and different organizations provide higher income. Finally, there is the mismatch between academic knowledge and workplace. The school's co-curriculum differ to the actual requirements for the industry.
Sea creatures are inspiring the latest devices that harness wave power. This one, called the oyster, sits on the ocean floor and opens and closes as waves pass over it. Cables attach it to generators on the shore. Since November 2009, it's been powering 9,000 homes in the Orkney Islands. Another device looks like a snake. The anaconda is made from a rubber tube filled with water that floats just below the surface. When a swell hits the front of it, the tube is squeezed. A bulge ripples down its length and powers a turbine in its tail. Prototypes are currently being tested, but the full-scale version will be 200 meters long. This system also looks like a snake, but this one is made of steel. It floats near the surface, where waves make its joints move. This drives hydraulic systems that power electrical generators. Like the anaconda, it's still being tested. Results will prove if these devices are up to the job of supplying viable sources of green energy.
Welsh is a Celtic language spoken in Wales by about 740,000 people, and in the Welsh colony in Patagonia, Argentina, by several hundred people. There are also Welsh speakers in England, Scotland, Canada, the USA, Australia, and New Zealand. At the beginning of the 20th century, about half of the population of Wales spoke Welsh as an everyday language. Towards the end of the century, the proportion of Welsh speakers had fallen to about 20%. According to the 2001 census, 582,368 people can speak Welsh. 659,301 people can either speak, read, or write Welsh, and 797,717 people, 28% of the population, claim to have some knowledge of the language. According to a survey carried out by S4C, the Welsh language TV channel, the number of Welsh speakers in Wales is around 750,000, and about 1.5 million people can understand Welsh. In addition, there are an estimated 133,000 Welsh speakers living in England, about 50,000 of them in the Greater London
Wilson came then from a different world, and he became the focal point of a broad mainstream American culture that thought that modern literature and wanted modern literature to be able to be read and appreciated by ordinary people. They were not modernists in an abstract sense, and certainly some of them, like T.S. Eliot and Faulkner, were too difficult for some of their writings to be read by ordinary people. But this was a world before the division between the brows or between elite or whatever had established itself as part of our consciousness. Wilson was a major player in the successful effort of his generation to establish at the heart of American life an innovative literature that would equal the great cultures of Europe. And he knew that the great cultures of Europe were there. He was not a product of a narrow American studies kind of training at all. He joined a high artistic standard with an openness to all experience and a belief that literature was as much a part of life for everyone as conversation. He thought that Proust and Joyce and Yeats and Eliot could and should be read by ordinary Americans and helped that to happen. Wilson was a very various man. Over a period of almost 50 years, he was a literary journalist, an investigative reporter, a brilliant memoirist, and dedicated journal keeper. His biographical histories, To the Finland Station and Patriotic Gore, are profoundly influential with Americans today.
In today's lecture, I'm going to talk about changes in air pollution since the middle of the last century and what has created these changes. So, by the 1950s, air pollution was very visible, with frequent thick black fogs known as smogs in many large cities around the world. The main source of this pollution was from factories, and it caused severe health problems. For example, a particularly severe smog in London in 1952 caused over 4,000 deaths. Obviously, something had to be done, and in 1956 a Clean Air Act was introduced in Britain. This addressed the pollution from factories, and the smog soon disappeared. However, as you know, these days air pollution is still a big issue. The main difference between now and the 1950s is that you can't see it, it's invisible. Also, the main source of pollution now is from cars and lorries, and although these don't produce visible signs, this air pollution is still a significant risk to health. And one of the key factors in the rise of this type of pollution is that we have all become much more vehicle dependent. There are far more cars and lorries, trains and planes than in the 1950s, and this is now the main source of air pollution around the world.
Milk is not typical of all monasteries for many reasons. First, it is very grand, which most, especially later foundations, aren't. Secondly, it was founded in the countryside, whereas in the 17th and 18th centuries, a good proportion of foundations were made in towns. Thirdly, it still owns a substantial amount of land, because fourthly, it lies in the Austrian Republic, the only European country where grand old monasteries have been in continuous existence since they were founded, 900, 1,000, even in one case 1,200 years ago.
Let me go to Hemingway and talk a little bit about him, in many ways as a kind of gateway or a guide to a global vision of American literature. Hemingway was very much a world traveler. Basically, you can get a map of the world by just looking at his writings, but he had a special love of the Spanish language. So For Whom the Bell Tolls, we'll be reading this in classes about the Spanish Civil War. And Hemingway was there as a war correspondent, but we can see that he actually got into combat situations right here. It's really interesting to think about Hemingway as both a journalist and also a novelist. The global dimension of Hemingway, but also the global dimension of the Spanish Civil War itself. It was a civil war, it was between two sides fighting in Spain, but it was also very much an international war in the sense that Russia was a part of it, Germany was a part of it, Italy was a part of it. It very much was a gathering of a lot of nations converging on the soil of Spain and fighting. Let me remind you what we had started to talk about. The class is organized into 3 fairly specific topics. The first of which is extrasolar planets. Planets around stars other than the Sun. Exoplanets, so called. That's our topic. One of the things that I pointed out last time is that, surprisingly enough, until 10 years ago none of these were known. And it's only a very recent development that there's any actual evidence that these things exist. So, one question you might ask is, why are these things so hard to find? The science fiction folks seem to have no trouble, they just sort of go around in their spaceships and find these things all over the place. And to consider that question, let me show you a picture. Here's a picture of a star. This is the star Sirius. It's the brightest. It's a blow-up obviously of a photograph plus a little photoshopped arrow. That's not a celestial object, so this is a blow-up of a photograph of the star Sirius. Sirius is the brightest star in the sky to the easily visible with the naked eye. In fact, as I say, the brightest star. It's one of the closest stars. It's a little bit brighter than the sun intrinsically, but it's 10 light years away or so. This class is about the post-emancipation African American experience. It is about American history. And I hope that point is frankly very obvious, but one never quite understands or can anticipate all of these things. It is about American history fundamentally. At its core, the course is about citizenship, the most important keyword for the entire class. The course is about citizenship, how one becomes a citizen, what one does to preserve that citizenship. At its core then, the class asks the question, what does it mean to be American? Now I will ask this question explicitly a few times in the class, but it implicitly is woven through so much of what I'm going to be talking about. What does it mean to be American?